Hello, everyone. Welcome to COVID-19 and the Future of the World Trade Organization. So thanks so much to everyone for participating in the event and everyone for joining us. My name is Carolina. I'm a student here at SAIS, and I will be moderating today's event. So today we will be discussing the barriers in the WTO that have contributed to what is now a north-south divide in access to medicine, and what we can do to bring an end to the pandemic everywhere, and be prepared for the next one. So our first speaker today is Lori Wallach. Lori is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, a 25-year veteran of congressional trade battles starting with the 1990s fight over NAFTA. She was named as one of Politico's 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries, transforming American politics in 2016 for her leadership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership debate. Lori has written extensively on terms and outcomes of trade agreements, including in her 2004 book. Thank you, Lori, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and for the initiative of organizing this event. It's an honor to be here. And I am going to do a little bit of an overview that puts in context the situation we're in. So the World Trade Organization began in 1995, and it was a fairly bold experiment. Prior to that, trade agreements covered trade. They set border taxes and the amount of stuff, tariffs is the border taxes, the amount, quotas, for goods crossing borders. And with the WTO, for the first time, that system, the boundaries are exploded to set rules on lots of other issues, including, most importantly, for this discussion, intellectual property. So prior to the WTO, from the 1940s, after World War II on, was an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. The GATT, again, said tariffs and quota rates for trade in goods, and it had some basic rules, like most favored nation. Everyone in the agreement has to treat each other the same for border taxes. The WTO was a very bold experiment. So the GATT, which was over here, the GATT became one of 24 agreements hanging off of this new thing, the WTO. And one of those new agreements was something that never had been in a trade agreement before. In fact, it was the kind of thing that the free trade philosophers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo probably would have been rolling in their graves to see put into a trade agreement, because it was monopoly protections for intellectual property. So for everyone who had studied economics, the classic rent-seeking monopoly, protectionism, is when the government intervenes and guarantees a monopoly, so just one interest can sell something and jack up the price. So the notion that a free trade agreement would have intellectual property monopolies, whatever the merits of having intellectual property exclusive periods where the creator can, through a patent, through a copyright, etc., exploit their design, whatever the merits generally of that system, the notion that that would be inserted into a free trade agreement still is a very controversial matter, both for supporters of agreements like the WTO. Jagdish Bhagwati, a professor from Columbia Law School, a very ardent free trader and supporter of the WTO, thought putting in such an agreement was very bad. And then a lot of public health officials and developing country officials and folks from consumer and other NGOs, because what ended up happening is an agreement called TRIPS. The aspects of trade-related intellectual property was inserted into the WTO as one of those several dozen agreements that was enforced. And the TRIPS agreement requires of every WTO signatory country, of which there are currently 164, from least developing countries and tiny Pacific Island nations, all the way to the European Union as a body, as a member, and the United States. So all of those countries are obliged to meet the rules that are enforced by the WTO, except if there's an exception. So for the TRIPS agreement rules, there's some exceptions for least developing countries, for instance. But for everyone else, you have to make sure your domestic laws meet the rules that are set up in these agreements. And so the WTO has a key provision, because as a lot of students are on, you're all studying international policymaking. And so, you know, one of the big banes of the existence of international policymaking is enforcement. These would be the first enforceable international rules, because the WTO, its enforcement mechanism, can impose sanctions, trade sanctions. So a key provision of the agreement that established the WTO, the so-called Marrakesh Agreement, is each country shall ensure the conformity of its domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached agreements. So every country has to make sure its domestic laws meet these rules. And if you don't, unlike, say, the International Labor Organization or Multilateral Environmental Agreement or the UN Human Rights Treaties, there's an enforcement system where one country can challenge another country in front of a tribunal at the WTO, which is based in Geneva. And that tribunal can authorize the imposition of trade sanctions, billions in dollars of trade sanctions, depending on what the claimed loss is, that stay in place until the country gets rid of the conflict, gets rid of the law. So in the history of the WTO, you know, a lot of powerful countries like the US have sacked laws versus get in the way of having to face trade sanctions. In fact, very few countries have not done that. There have been a handful of examples in hundreds of WTO cases. So that is the background into which we now find ourselves already 25 years ago, 20 years ago, in the HIV/AIDS crisis, having antiretrovirals that were an amazing medicine that made HIV not a death sentence, but a disease you could control. And those drugs were under patent. So what are intellectual property rights are protected by the TRIPS? We're going to hear this from Berger, but one of those things is patents. And people in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean and Asia were dying needlessly because they couldn't get the antiretrovirals. Because in the US, because of the monopoly, the price was $1 gazillion, when really it didn't cost very much at all to make the medicines. And so unless there was some way for that medicine to be available, well, it wasn't. And so these WTO rules got in the way, and it was a huge campaign that went on for several years, and disgustingly, heartbreakingly, millions of people died needlessly because these intellectual property barriers were in the way of this life-saving medicine getting out to everyone. Since the WTO, other trade agreements have also included these intellectual property rules, again, totally contrary to the concept of free trade. Whatever you think about IP protections, what the hell they're doing in a trade agreement is another business. But so that is the background of the WTO. It was super controversial when these rules were added in, and the developing countries are basically put into a situation where it was either you don't get to have the trade agreements or you have to have these other rules. And so it was what's called a single undertaking strategy, and a lot of developing countries got pushed into doing it. So that's our background. I'm going to turn it back over to Carolina, who can introduce Berger.
Thank you, Lori. And just so everyone knows, if they have any questions, you could just drop them in the Q&A. We'll be going over them later. So our next speaker is Berger Kilic. Berger is a scholar, lawyer, and digital rights advocate. She directs the Digital Rights Program and is also the Research Director for Public Citizens Access to Medicines Program. She has researched and written extensively on intellectual property, innovation, digital rights and trade, and provided technical advice and assistance in numerous countries. Thank you for joining us, Berger.
Thank you, Carolina. And thank you, Lori, for doing the groundwork for me so that then I can build up on what you said about the WTO and TRIPS and intellectual property. As Lori mentioned, before 1995, trade was not a forum for intellectual property discussions. Most of these discussions were taking place in World Intellectual Property Organization, which is a UN institution. But the problem with the WIPO was like the WIPO agreements, and we had a couple of like agreements such as Paris Agreement and so, some other copyright agreements at WIPO. But the problem was like the agreements were binding, but they were not necessarily like enforceable. You know, like if countries don't comply with the agreements, there were no sanctions. There was a limited enforcement. So before 1995, like copyright and pharmaceutical industries, they were like, no, we need a solution, a global solution. So we need to take this IP out of the WIPO and bring it to the WTO so that the IP becomes a trade commodity and we get an international agreement on intellectual property. That was the beginning of the beginning. And TRIPS, which is like a constitution for IP, trade-related aspects of intellectual property agreement. It's a World Trade Organization agreement, and it really changed the global IP policies. First of all, as I said, it's like a constitution-like agreement, so it sets the minimum requirements. It's up to the countries to implement those provisions. But as Lori mentioned, since it's in WTO, it's binding and enforceable if you don't comply with your commitments, trade commitments. You can face trade sanctions from the countries. They can take it to you to the appellate body. They can sue you there. So there are many implications if you don't comply with your trade commitments. That's why like TRIPS started a new era in IP policy and global IP protection. It sets the minimum requirements. It's up to countries to go beyond what's in the TRIPS, and that's what we've been observing since the introduction of TRIPS agreement. Like many countries, like the US and the EU and other developed countries, they have IP protection and IP regimes which go beyond what's in the TRIPS agreement. One interesting thing about TRIPS is like before, one of the highlights of the agreement was the patent protection for pharmaceuticals. Before the TRIPS agreement, there were 80 plus countries which excluded pharmaceuticals from patent protection. And then it was one of the goals for the pharmaceutical industry that we need to get a global protection for pharmaceutical, global patent protection for pharmaceutical. And that's what TRIPS exactly did. TRIPS said that patents shall be available for inventions in all fields of technology. So and the member states, they committed to grant patents for pharmaceuticals because they didn't have an excuse to exclude pharmaceuticals from the scope of patent protection. And it really changed the things for many people living in developing countries, because in those countries, patents were not, pharmaceuticals were not protected by patents. And then these countries, when they suddenly introduced these measures, suddenly they saw that like, oh my God, pharmaceutical companies, they have the monopoly protections, because when you have a patent doesn't necessarily give you the right to use the invention, but it gives you the right to exclude others from using, selling, importing, exporting your invention. So what happened was pharmaceutical companies were like, okay, now we have the patents, we have the monopoly control, so no other drug company can manufacture or drug, and they set the prices very high. And the generic companies, they face with that dilemma, okay, either you infringe someone's patent or go out of business. And in many countries, we observed that they went out of business. They changed like their businesses because it was too risky and too expensive to infringe patents. And many countries, especially in global south, faced with lots of access to medicines problems. And Matthew will tell you more about the HIV/AIDS movement and the implications of like patents and introduction of patent protection for pharmaceuticals in global south. But I like to mention that, like, you know, early like 2000s was like has started a new era for us. And then many countries, like, you know, were not able to use the flexibilities, because TRIPS agreement, it comes as a package. It has rules, but then it takes flexibilities, which gives like members flexibility to use certain policy measures and take like necessary measures to protect public health and public interest. But they didn't have the capacity, they didn't know how to use it, and it wasn't very clear. And most of the countries, they didn't even have manufacturing capacity to produce those drugs, such as, like you issue compulsory license. Okay, that's great, you issue a compulsory license if you're in India, but if you are living in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is the least developed country. If you are living in, like, let's say, let's think about a country with a developing country with limited manufacturing capacity, let's say, for instance, Venezuela. Yeah, maybe I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not it's a least developed country. But like, if you are living in a developing country, if you don't have a manufacturing capacity, you can't use the flexibilities. Then the Doha Declaration, and if you are familiar with access to medicines terminology, you probably hear about the Doha Declaration, which reaffirmed like members' right to use the flexibilities to protect public health. It changed the direction of the discussion, because before the Doha, it was all about protection, and suddenly discussions started to become become more about flexibilities, how to protect public health, and how to provide access to medicines. So those discussions have been going on since the early 2000s. We still have an access to medicines problem that we need to tackle. And COVID-19 only made that problem more and more obvious for many people, not only the access to medicines people, but people living around the world, especially in global south countries. They face that problem. Oh no, we don't have like manufacturing capacity to produce these medicines, and we need to wait in the line to get our vaccine. So there are all these discussions taking place in the WTO about TRIPS waiver now, like, because developing countries, especially the countries which do not have access to vaccines and other COVID-19 health technologies, asking developed countries to waive the patent protection for for 3 years during the COVID-19 pandemic, so that they can have freedom to operate, and they can manufacture these drugs, vaccines, diagnostics. And this discussion has been going on since October 2020. It has been more than a year, and we are still discussing whether we should waive IP protection or not. And it's kind of ironic, because during the COVID-19, we waived everything, we compromise our like personal freedoms. Like today marked the, opening of the US border. And like many people, like you have compromised many things, like especially our freedoms for public health. And now we are still discussing whether we should waive the IP rights, like these private rights of big pharmaceutical companies, so that countries in global south manufacture these drugs and save their people. So I'll stop there, and I can tell a little bit more about the waiver during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Berger. So our final speaker is Matthew Rose. Matthew is the Director of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at HealthGap, that is Global Access Project, and a longstanding HIV and social justice activist. He brings over a decade of experience in community engagement, federal health policy, HIV science, and advancing health equity. Prior to joining HealthGap, Matthew served as the Policy and Advocacy Manager for the National...
Oh, you're doing too much. You don't got to read the whole bio. Thank you, though, Carolina. Yeah, so Lori breached on this at the approach, but I want to take you all kind of back into history for HIV. So we've been fighting, keep in context, we've been fighting HIV for 40 years. In the first, we officially discovered the virus in 81. Fast forward to 1990, when we finally have some initial results to tell us that there is some drug you can take. The mid-90s in the United States, we started witnessing what we call the Lazarus Effect, where people who are told that they are going to die within months of a diagnosis and start withering away are given triple drug therapy and come back to life. So you see from wasted bodies to fully healthy people again. Fast forward again to the early 2000s, end of the 90s, where a group of activists, and you're starting to see this around the world, where people are rising up and realizing that these amazing drugs that are saving all of these lives and saving lives, I mean saving certain lives in developed countries, aren't making it to the developing world. And groups like Health Gap kind of spring from this. And we recognize that you've got to donate the drugs, get the drugs in bodies, and ditch the debt is our first campaign that we run. But what we learn is that it's not just getting the drugs, but finding a way to finance and pay for those drugs is going to be key. Because if you pay for the drugs at the prices that you're paying in the developed world, you will never get anywhere near saving the amount of lives. So for context, right now in the United States, one of the most commonly prescribed drugs is known as Truvada. With the list price for that drug is $16,000 for a year's supply. Go to South Africa, same drug, generic version, enstracidivine and tenofovir, cost $300. And that's because of what we were able to accomplish in the Doha Declaration and allowing people to waive IP barriers and allow generic manufacturers to make drugs at pretty much cost. Now, you've probably heard from the fun times of paying attention to global health policy and talking about IP, or just being in the United States. We pay a ridiculous markup on our drugs. But we realize that trying to make developing economies cover that cost means that they didn't have the ability to do literally anything else. There were no options for treatment. There were no options for getting people's lives back. There were no options for just basic living and accommodations if we paid for these drugs at their costs. So with some radical activists and some very unfamiliar partners, we were able to change the narrative of HIV. Now, part of this comes from, like I said, your unfamiliar folks, and which is why you never know who's going to show up for you in these fights. And by that, I mean George W. Bush, a Republican president who cares a lot about the thoughts of business, had his mind changed and persuaded through the actions of a couple individuals and some very, very amazing activists who pushed negotiations, discussions, and conversations and created programs that say, you need to care about HIV, but not only do you need to care about HIV, but the only way for you fundamentally to care and actually change the problem that you're seeing is for there to be a solution on the IP side. You can't pay these high levels of drugs and still think you're going to save millions. And when the need is high enough, a breaking of the dam happened. Now, as Lori mentioned earlier, this breaking of the dam took years to implement and further years to get into practice. And during that entire time, millions of people died globally from what could have been and what is now, with access to medicines, a chronic condition where people can live the same amount of lifetime as someone who does not have HIV. But instead, we let politics and priorities make us think that we cannot. And remember, all of these rules are just rules that we as a collective decide to agree upon. We decide whose life has value, who should have access, and whose priorities should be protected. In the lens of HIV, we decided that enough was enough and we need to change the conversation. And bold activists refused to take treatment until their friends got access, had die-ins, confronted political players and duty bearers around the world to say that the system of the world is not working and it will not save not only my life, but the lives of the people around me, the lives of my friends, my family, my community. And we thought again that that same bold action would be enough to stir us to affirm that in COVID times, we've got to change the script. We've got to change the way people do things. And we know that these systems that have been built up and reinforced over and over again to protect monopoly power don't actually prioritize things like human life, the quality of that life. And it could be done. I will grant you that some pharmaceutical companies have great invention. But at what point does their invention need to come at the cost of millions of people? And as government actors and other duty bearers, we get to make decisions about that. As policymakers, we get to decide who we prioritize and at what costs, and have to be willing to accept those costs or be shamed out of those costs. Some people decided that no more in my name will I let you take these actions on my behalf. And in those moments, we truly see a changing of the system. So the HIV community does what it has done best, which is rally the world to remember that it can care about the stranger. It can care about the other, and that we have more than enough to care and process and give to those in need. And unfortunately, we have seen this battle play out again in COVID times, but it's not over yet. It took 2 years for us to get to the Doha Declaration. We've burned 1 year on COVID. What will we do with this next year? And I'll leave that open for I assume will be a number of questions and for the brilliance of my other colleagues.
Thank you, Matthew. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Lori for some concluding remarks.
All right, sorry about a little technical difficulty there. So just to pick up from where Matt left off, where we are now is South Africa and India in October of last year offered a temporary waiver of those WTO TRIPS rules. And their waiver covered temporarily waiving 4 different intellectual property monopoly tools, patents, copyrights, something called industrial designs, and something that is trade secrets / secret data. It's basically the know-how. And they propose to have that apply to vaccines, to treatments, to tests, diagnostic tests, broadly to the medical technologies used to deter, to treat, to try and stop COVID. And as we have seen, there is never going to be an end to this pandemic unless everyone around the world can get vaccinated. We saw in the US, we sort of thought we had like a head of steam after horrible loss of life and waves of COVID, and then Delta came. And Delta started someplace else. And there is no one in the world who's going to be safe until everyone gets vaccinated. Yet now we know that we don't have enough vaccine being produced. This is the key I want to underscore. It's not only an inequitable distribution, it's not enough. And it's especially outrageous because they're qualified producers in many parts of the world where right now vaccination rates are indescribably shamefully low. So in low-income countries, vaccination rates are about 8%. So to put in that perspective, most healthcare workers aren't vaccinated. People are walking around totally exposed, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people die needlessly. And if you want to think about it from a US perspective, from a European perspective, from the countries that have the pharmaceutical companies that have come up with the miraculous mRNA, messenger RNA vaccines, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna NIH vaccines, thinking narrowly about it, it's in the US, it's in the European direct public health and economic interests, because as long as there are mass outbreaks, there are new mutations being created. They're not just going to kill millions of people someplace else that are going to come back and have a direct impact. So in addition to being greedy and short-sighted and immoral, it is just practically necessary for everyone around the world to be able to get more vaccines made. So a variety of countries joined South Africa and India pretty early on. The Trump administration blocked this waiver. And then after some wonderful campaigning around the country, and once a new trade representative, a woman named Ambassador Catherine Tai, was confirmed by the Senate and came to be our top trade official, the Biden administration reversed the Trump administration's outrageous blocking of this waiver. The WTO works by consensus. So the US was leading the blockers, and everyone from developing countries we're basically left with most of the developed countries on the wrong side. On May 5th, when the Biden administration came out in favor of the waiver, that shifted the dynamics, and a lot of rich countries joined the US initially. And at this point, the situation is that the European Union, which again is one member of the WTO, even though it's dozens of countries, but the EU, directed by Germany. Germany is really the blocker there. France is for the waiver, Spain's for the waiver, Italy's for the waiver. Germany has the whole EU at this point basically blocking the waiver. As well, the UK and Switzerland are actively against. The US has not to date really put its shoulder in to push through an arrangement. But the scenario is at this point, 130 countries pro waiver, the EU, UK, and Switzerland against, and a timeline that seems so far out in the beginning of May when the US came out in favor of the waiver. The November 30th ministerial conference of the WTO is now just around the corner. You don't have to have a ministerial conference to do a waiver, but it is like an action forcing moment because a lot of people are thinking about it. So the WTO functions regularly. It has meetings that are different kinds of meetings where waivers can happen. But while the heads of the WTO's delegations, the trade ministers, the people like the US Ambassador Tai, the trade ministers of all the countries will be together, this is a good time to do this. And certainly after seeing what didn't happen with the waiver for HIV/AIDS meds, it cannot happen again that millions of people die needlessly because a few pharmaceutical corporations have convinced a few countries to block the will of every other country in the world that wants to waive what were rules that were lopsided in the first instance. But just to put a fine edge to it, the WTO, Article 9, Roman 9, in the Marrakesh Agreement is a waiver provision that's explicitly for this situation, which is when there is a reason of urgency, extraordinary circumstance to waive the rules. The HIV/AIDS circumstance was one, this is one now. And on November 30th, when the world gets together, if the EU doesn't get out of the way, if the US doesn't step up and lead, we could miss this window to do this right thing, which already is months and months too late. And we need to make sure that it happens. So that is where we are right now. It is doable. There is a very big international campaign trying to get it done now, not later. And I think I will stop there. The way people talk about this is, and the way you can see it online, hashtag TRIPS waiver now. Trade-related intellectual property is the TRIPS waiver now. And there are campaigners all around the world who are trying to make sure this happens now. But if it doesn't happen now, they ain't going away, because until it happens, what is a key obstacle to production of sufficient vaccines, treatments, tests is going to stay in the way. And those WTO rules more broadly are looking like a worse and worse idea, but in the short term, we need to get them waived. So I think I will stop there and open it up for Q&A.
Thanks, Lori. Okay, so we do have a few questions in the chat right now. Everyone who has questions, just drop them in there in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So we have a question here. It says, thank you to our speakers. Has the WTO received any proposals that prevent companies from exporting their patented products within controlled range of above fair market value, similar to how anti-dumping measures prevent companies from exporting at below fair market cost of production value? Anyone else want to jump in on the speakers? All the speakers, you should turn your cameras back on and unmute yourselves. I do not know of any such proposal, but I'm not sure I understand the question. The issue at this point is the ability of manufacturers, say in Africa, in Latin America, and other parts of Asia, to be able to make, particularly the mRNA vaccines, if you're talking about vaccines, because relatively speaking, unlike sort of vaccines that are based on having to
so basically brew like the adenovirus basis of the mRNA vaccines, relatively speaking, can be scaled up. The production can be scaled up relatively quickly. And the goal basically is to get these, the entire thicket of intellectual property rules. So for these complex mRNA vaccines, what Berger mentioned, the flexibilities, the Doha Declaration, which was a WTO declaration that said, hey, you can do compulsory licensing this way and that way. That stuff doesn't really work for mRNA vaccines that have 100+ different kinds of intellectual property and that have supply chains that go across borders. So the trick to being able to get the amount of vaccines needed to actually end the pandemic is to be able to unlock these intellectual property barriers. Now, it's not obviously the only thing, there's more to it, and be able to have more producers manufacturing.
Okay, great. So our next question is on the topic of global vaccination campaigns. How can we provide sufficient vaccinations to areas where excessive conflict or totalitarian regimes prohibit access? What actions can a multilateral organization use to encourage unwilling participants in global vaccine distribution once they are more available?
I can chime on this one. I mean, you know, the discussion here is about supply, and we keep hearing this from the pharma and some of the pharma and co people like, yeah, but distribution is also very problematic because those countries, they don't have the systems. You know, so first of all, like, I like to make it clear that like people have been like getting vaccines for many years in global south, and most of these vaccines are manufactured in global south. But the problem here we have is not a distribution problem. The problem is a supply problem. We have a limited supply and we have like lots of demand. We need to vaccinate everyone living on this planet, and we don't have enough supply. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to sort out the supply problem, not the distribution. Distribution becomes problematic if you don't have enough supply. If you're a country in global south, if you receive 100,000 vaccines, and if you have to distribute it to 5 million people, you have a problem, and that will be corruption. That will be like, that it will be hard to talk about like equity. It will be hard to talk about like, people will be talking about discrimination, bias, and other things, because like those guys, and maybe they will say that, oh, but everything is so slow, they don't know how to distribute these vaccines. No, it's not about the distribution. It's again about the supply, because you need to come up with a sustainable solution to distribute those vaccines equitably. So, like, let's focus on the supply issue. If we have more supply, which will mean that we have more vaccine to give those countries, and then the countries will change their attitude towards vaccines, because people are getting more and more like skeptical of vaccines, because they see on their TV, like here people are like flying from Europe to US and celebrating they can travel, and there is no plan for like most of the people living in global south. They don't even know when they will have access to vaccines, so they get more and more skeptical. But I think like the discussion should really focus on supply issue.
I'll add in really quickly. It's always interesting when people want to talk about, how will they get vaccines to the global south? The same way they get all the other vaccines to the global south. Like we run massive worldwide immunization campaigns. NGOs bring vaccines. The International Rescue Committee has been trying to procure and been somewhat vaccinating refugee camps. Like we can get it there. The question is there supply available for them to even use that? Like we have international mechanisms and humanitarian organizations that can solve some of these problems. Like we've built that. But if you do not have a commodity to give them to put it through, you can't get to the delivery issue. And it probably won't be that much of a delivery issue. And we're already working. I will say we are working, like literally USAID programs a whole bunch of dollars to work on vaccine hesitancy in countries that we have no vaccine to give them to yet, but we're working on vaccine hesitancy. So.
And to that point, as we're talking about supply issues and supplying these vaccines, there's a question here: which countries are you hoping to support first? Which I guess is to ask, how do we decide which developing country gets access to these vaccines first, if there is a waiver available?
So
I think it's not okay.
go ahead. Go.
No, go ahead, Matt.
All right, I was going to say the great global solution, and I use air quotes with that because it's been utterly failing, was we created this huge equitable distribution format through this thing called COVAX, where we were going to buy and then donate vaccines to people. Here's a little story. Donations don't work because people hoard for their own countries. There's a whole bunch of media about why COVAX was an utter failure. But there are systems of how people think we should and could be equitably distributing the vaccines to other countries, especially making sure that, first of all, you want to protect the healthcare system, then you want to target people who are most vulnerable. So you're looking at the older crowd, and then you can kind of mess from there. However, if you actually just produced enough supply, again, solve some of these problems.
I just want to throw out the math. So the world needed someplace between 14 and 15 billion doses before we knew of the need to have regular boosters and before kids were getting vaccinated. And this is not like diphtheria where you need to like keep up with population growth. But if it takes you 3 years to get to everyone in a particular country, you got 3 years. There's going to be an ongoing demand. And the industry, the current vaccine makers, said they could do 12 billion doses this year. So it wasn't sufficient to what was needed anyway. But they're at about half. They're a little better than half. They're not going to make the pledged promise. They didn't make what they promised last year. And now we know we need more than we thought we needed, which they weren't going to make enough for this year. And every time there's a major variant, there's going to have to be a booster to take care of the variants. The capacity worldwide for this pandemic and to have in place the capacity to not have 2 years go by of not having the capacity to make vaccines to save people for the next pandemic is what is at stake with this waiver. Because there are manufacturers all over the world, so we don't have to choose which country is going to get it first. The point is not to be in that situation, in part as a public, skip the morality. Just as a public health matter, in a globalized world, no one is safe, literally, until you can vaccinate everyone. So getting this capacity established is the only way to end this pandemic, and it's the only way to be ready for the next pandemic. And that means getting the barriers out of the way so that capacity can be built up significantly, so it's not an either-or scenario.
Yeah, and on that point, I just want to make something very clear. We don't really need to save those people. They can save themselves if we let them to save themselves. That's the problem. We've been telling them, don't worry, we have a plan for you. Just wait. Like we told them last year, just wait for us to get vaccinated. We will donate the ones that we don't use. And now we are telling them, don't worry, like we will save you. We will get you the vaccines. And for 1 year, they've been asking, please let us save ourselves. Let us do that. We have capacity. We have manufacturers. We have scientists. We've been vaccinating our populations for many, many years. We know what we need. Give us what we need. But we insist on, no. We know what you need. And that's not what you need. You don't know what you need. So I think this is more about letting those people and those countries and the experts and policymakers and the governments in those countries to save themselves. We should just give them that opportunity instead of coming up with artificial plans made in the Washington, D.C., Brussels, or other capitals, because they know what they need and we need to give them.
I want to add really quick to what Brishi was saying. I have talked to a number of my African colleagues, and they're all the mindset of, we are done begging for doses. It has been over a year, and you have barely vaccinated the continent at all. I was talking to friends in Uganda who has a 1% of their adult population is vaccinated. The highest country, South Africa, is only at 20%. So they're done, and they're watching the United States be like, oh, we're throwing away doses because we have so many and people won't take them. And they're like, why? This new travel situation of you have to be vaccinated to travel is just an insult to them. And they're like, we could have, if you had given us the things we wanted and asked for, we could have had that. But worse, we now have antiretroviral treatments that we know how to make that you won't give us access to, that we could be using to save lives right now. And so just give us what we asked for. Stop trying to presuppose what you think we need and just respond to what we actually told you we wanted.
So our next question, we're going to be turning the conversation a bit. It's, will the EU position change with the retirement of Chancellor Merkel and a new German leader?
I'm laughing. I think Lori and Bruce should have to answer this one because we have been so many calls where they've been, neck deep in German politics for months.
So ich hob die Daumen, which means like I cross my fingers, but in German, I hold my thumb. That will be what happens. I think that the good news is that the Green Party, which is one of the parties that won in the German election, is pro-waiver. The Social Democrats are split. The government a coalition government's being formed. The third party that's going to be involved, the Liberals, much more like a neoliberal, it's a business party, are not pro-waiver. I think it's hard to know what will happen, but I do think the adamance of opposition to the waiver under any circumstances will be diminished. And it was a very personal thing with Angela Merkel. I think as a scientist, in part, there was a personal dedication to stopping that waiver that has been mystifying in many ways. But the thing I think that is a countervailing issue is within the European Council, other heads of state have really made clear that they think it's important that there is a waiver. And as well, the geopolitics of the issue are such that one of the things that Germany has always been very supportive of is the existence of multilateral institutions like the WTO. And the WTO being perceived worldwide as the obstacle to ending the pandemic is like dangerous to the health of the WTO. Like COVID could claim the WTO as one of its victims at this point. It's already on shaky ground, and this could be the thing that is like the final death knell of an organization that's having a major legitimacy crisis. If it can't get the hell out of the way, I mean, ostensibly every global body should be trying to be part of the solution. But in this case, it's just like, get the hell out of the way. And then the second geopolitical point is Germany is quite obsessed, as often are US presidents, about sort of the competition between liberal democracies and autocracies. And I say liberal democracies because it means sort of liberal in the sense of market-based. That's the technical term that gets used. So market-based democracies is how I would say it. And it is not a good look where Germany and the EU by name is blocking a waiver for the whole developing world that the whole developing world has said they want. It just looks very neo-colonialist. You have a lot of countries saying, hey, we know what we need and what we want, and it's this thing. Oh, you're going to tell us what's better for us? And then you have the US having gotten a lot of credit for having stepped up initially, but also, there is a question about, can the US be doing more to try and at least get the Europeans to back the hell out of the way, if not to get this over the finish line? The bottom line, though, is you have these amazing vaccines from Germany and from the US that no one can get around the world. The mRNA vaccines are hardly anyplace else. And then you have China and Russia who are doing very aggressive vaccine diplomacy. And whatever complications you can have with the vaccines being produced there is no question that if you're in the developing world and you have a vaccine, there's a very high chance that it's going to be one of the Chinese vaccines, which of the 6.5 million vaccines that have been administered, half of them are the Chinese vaccines. And we know that they're not as effective on the Delta variant. So as a public health matter, that is not great. but it's also a really, the optics of that, of, you know, you, as from the geopolitics of Germany, I think that can also influence the adamance on blocking the waiver. And that is what my German colleagues and friends say.
So our next question, how many companies have you reached out to for help? How has the private sector been in trying to get this waiver?
Matt, you look like you're going to explode. Would you like to speak to that?
I mean, so there is essentially a game of, if we let you in on this waiver, you'll come for everything else. So we had to play actually a lot of time just getting business to just sit down. The entertainment industry thought that we were going to allow for copyright infringement on music, and they made that a big deal to begin with. But more and more companies are starting to say, we need an end to the pandemic, and we're not going to say how you need to do it, but you just need to do it. And so and they're getting more and more irritated by some of their colleagues who keep raking in more and more money while they continue to feel the ill effects of the pandemic. So it's this awkward dance. And sometimes in Washington, it's the person who remains silent that's your friend, because they're just like not in your way anymore. But, you know, even the Chamber of Commerce was super opposed at first, and then slowly started backing away when they realized that, oh no, the rest of our members are being held up by a few.
And I mean, that is spot on right. You got a few pharmaceutical companies raking in like obscene, basically profits off the pandemic. And then you have the travel industry and the hospitality industry and numerous other industries just crushed because there's no end to the pandemic. But also, you know, pharma's got a lot of lobbyists. And so not only have the other companies, you know, been pressured by pharma and have not really stood up to battle pharma yet. As Matt said, at least some of them haven't been on the wrong side of it, but pharma's been doing their best to block it and have been able to rely on Germany to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But, you know, everyone who saw all those advertisements a couple months ago that were attacking the Biden administration for doing the right thing, for trying to end the pandemic, that was millions and millions of dollars of pharma money that was blaring through CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News constantly, like every minute on the minute, that, oh, heaven forbid, there's a waiver. So the companies actually most companies haven't been that helpful, unfortunately, which gets to what we all can do, which is, you know, how did the pharmaceutical companies weren't for the waiver at the WTO for HIV/AIDS either. They fought it tooth and nail. And so basically we, as citizens, as residents, as human beings with political relationships to leaders in all of our countries, a lot of people are here, but some of you who are at school here are actually voters in other countries. What we need to do is basically organize. And, you know, if you're from Germany, you've got special work. We need to organize to get our governments to represent our interests at the WTO, because the companies are basically largely, the pharmaceutical companies are an obstacle, and the other companies probably aren't going to get up and push. Some people have asked where this recording will be, and it will be on the SICE website for sure, but like we're going to put it on our website, which is www.tradewatch.org. And I flagged that, and Matt has a great website as well, but at the Public Citizen website, you can see recordings of amazing high-level webinars Berger has organized with trade ministers from other countries, and you can find fact sheets and materials. If you want to get into it with your members of Congress about this issue, you can see all the citations and the fact sheets and the memos. So you've just heard us say things, but you want to get to the underlying source because you're students. You can find that information, tradewatch.org, and at Health Gap's website as well. It is a good set of materials to bulk yourself up, and we're going to have to just advocate and fight to get this done.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question really quickly. Matthew, if you could just elaborate on what you said about USAID running vaccine hesitancy programs. There's a bit of a confusion. about this topic?
Yeah, so we have recognized that vaccine hesitancy, mainly the vaccines that we give around the world, are child immunizations. So we boost you and do all your things in child, and then we don't talk about what you have to give about adults. And so we realized, as we watched in our own country what was happening, it came upon USAID that if you're going to bring vaccines to countries, you need people who are lining up, willing to take them right now with no questions asked, because their questions have already been answered. And so they are launching a number of educational programs across low and middle income countries, mainly low income countries, to try to have the conversation about what do you need about the vaccine, what do you need answered about the vaccine, how can we help you get engaged, how can you be helped? Because one of the challenges we've seen is sometimes when you deliver a vaccine in a country that's not ready, and you deliver it with a very short window of how long that vaccine still has in its shelf life, you can time out the vaccine. And that happened in a couple countries. And so trying to get ahead of that as we wait for the supply problem. But if we were generally making enough supply, then you could be like America, who's like, whenever you're ready, the vaccine's available. But you've got to figure out how do you increase demand and people being ready, especially when the developed world has told you to F off for most of this pandemic. And so they're just not, people in low-income countries don't necessarily trust us and trust what we're going to bring to them. And so there is that conversation.
Okay, so I have an interesting question here. NIH, a government agency, creates the base of many vaccines and medicines that pharma takes and makes vaccines and medicines, sometimes for free, and complete the process. How do we get the message out that pharma intellectual property can be taken away if medicines are developed in the US by government patent law, in addition to the Defense Production Act? Could someone speak about this Defense Production Act?
I can't necessarily talk about the Defense Protection Act just because I don't know the details, but I can talk a little bit about how things work in pharmaceuticals and the patent law. So the thing is, like, when we talk about NIH research, we talk about the basic research, and most of the basic research funded by the taxpayers, us, like, so the basic research taking place in NIH and universities, we invest or taxpayer money in that in that research, and many like scholars and scientists, they've been working on these technologies for many years. For instance, when you look at the mRNA technology, it was developed by University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, and a Hungarian scientist. She dedicated her life to mRNA. And she said that for many years, pharmaceutical companies had no interest in mRNA. So she relied on public funding until COVID-19. And as you can see, like with the mRNA technologies, we have BioNTech, a German company, and Moderna, and we didn't know about these companies before COVID, because they were small biotech companies which invested in mRNA technology, and most of the time they get the funds from public too. So there is a reality of public funding, but there is also another reality when when big pharmaceutical companies come into the picture and get all the benefits and the profits, because the big pharmaceutical company's role here is more about commercialization of that invention. There was a very interesting interview with the founder of BioNTech, and he was saying that even we had like the money and we had staff, and we were very dedicated to work on this vaccine, we needed a big partner. That's why we approached Pfizer, and Pfizer came into the picture and took over all the market from BioNTech, and now Pfizer is making the money and selling the vaccines all around the world because of they needed a global partner. So most of the time there are small players, and then big players like Pfizer, they come into the picture in later stages of development and take out that invention, because patent law protects invention, not necessarily the innovation. Patent law promotes innovation. But when we talk about nowadays pharma innovation, we don't necessarily talk about invention. We talk about the commercialization process. And that commercialization process is a business idea. Pfizer hasn't invested in this drug, you know, the invention of this drug. We invested, German taxpayers invested. And these companies, these small companies invested. So they have the patent rights. Pfizer role is more of a business role, but we are protecting Pfizer's interests because the patent system is so flawed now. So instead of protecting invention and the real science happening in those institutions, we are protecting the commercialization. We are protecting the interests of big pharmaceutical companies. That's why we've been saying it's time to put a hold on this and prioritize the public health. This is not about Pfizer's profits. This is about saving lives, giving opportunity to those people living in those countries to save themselves. And hopefully, we'll change our thinking about patent issues and intellectual property. We'll get there. But in order to get there, as Lori mentioned, we really need to work hard because the resistance is really, really strong because of pharma lobbying power.
So we are out of time, so we can't get to any more questions, but thank you all so much for a great discussion. Thank you to all our speakers for coming to speak to us today, and for everyone participating, thank you so much.